Sandman.
The rain hammered against the windows like 1,000 desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. I jolted awake at 3:47 a.m., my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The nightmare was already fading, leaving only fragments, dark water rising, a silhouette in the distance, and an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to my skin like cold sweat. I'm Marcus Webb, 30 years old, a data analyst from Portland, Oregon. I'd always considered myself rational, grounded in logic and facts. What happened that night would test everything I thought I knew about reality. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of my bedroom, I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand. That's when I saw him. Through the rain-streaked window, standing perfectly still in my backyard, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, and thin, draped in what looked like a black cloak that didn't move despite the violent wind and rain. A wide-brimmed black hat obscured where his head should be. He wasn't just standing there. He was facing my window. Facing me. I froze, the glass slipping from my trembling hand and shattering on the hardwood floor. Couldn't look away. Something about his stillness was wrong, unnatural. He didn't sway with the wind. Rain seemed to pass through him rather than bounce off. And though I couldn't see his face beneath that hat, I felt his gaze piercing through the darkness, through the glass, through me. Lightning split the sky, illuminating my backyard in stark white light. He was gone. I spent the rest of that night with every light in my house blazing, telling myself it was a lingering hallucination from the nightmare, a trick of shadows and rain. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next evening, I met my friends at our usual bar. Jake, my college roommate, and Sarah, who'd been part of our group since high school. I needed to tell someone, needed to hear their rational explanations that would make everything make sense again. "There was someone in my backyard last night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "During that storm, just standing there in the rain, staring at my window." Jake laughed, taking a swig of his beer. "Dude, probably just some drunk who wandered into the wrong yard. Did you call the cops?" "It wasn't like that. He was different. Tall, wearing old-fashioned clothes. A black cloak and hat. And the way he stood there, completely still." "Marcus, you said you woke up from a nightmare, right?" Sarah interrupted gently. "You were probably still half asleep. The mind plays tricks when you're in that state between dreaming and waking." I wanted to argue to make them understand, but how could I explain the feeling that had settled into my bones? The certainty that what I'd seen wasn't human? "Maybe you're right," I muttered, but I didn't believe it. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I found myself researching online late into the night, searching for similar sightings, strange figures in storms, anything that might validate what I'd experienced. It started with a random forum post I stumbled across at 2 a.m, my third night of obsessive searching. A user named Dark Skies Watcher had posted about seeing a tall figure in a black hat and cloak during a thunderstorm in Edinburgh, Scotland, 3 years ago. The post was brief, almost dismissive, but it mentioned something that made my blood run cold. 2 days later, the bridge collapsed. 23 people died. I created an account and messaged the user immediately, but the account had been inactive for over a year. No response came. But now I had a thread to pull. I spent every evening after work diving deeper into the rabbit hole. I searched newspaper archives, mythology databases, folklore collections, and obscure historical records. I looked for patterns, storms, mysterious figures, and tragedies. What I found was scattered, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle deliberately hidden across centuries and continents. But the pieces were there. A journal entry from a priest in Bavaria, dated 1847, described a specter in black seen during a terrible storm. 3 days later, a fire consumed half the village. In the margin of the journal, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "Der Regimen." A newspaper clipping from Tokyo, 1923, mentioned rumors of a rain demon spotted the night before the Great Kanto earthquake. The article dismissed it as superstition, but an accompanying letter to the editor insisted the writer had seen the figure with his own eyes. A ship's log from 1912 recorded a crewman's report of seeing a tall, cloaked man standing on the water during a storm 2 nights before the Titanic struck the iceberg. The captain had reprimanded the crewman for spreading panic. The pattern was undeniable. This figure, this entity, had been appearing for centuries, possibly millennia. And always tragedy followed. After 3 weeks of research, I had compiled a profile of what various cultures had called different names. Der Regimen, the Stormwalker, the Herald of Sorrow, the Witness. But the name that appeared most frequently in English-language sources was simple and chilling: the Rainman. According to the fragmented accounts I'd pieced together, the Rainman was described consistently across cultures and time periods. He appeared only during heavy rain, always at night. His form was that of an impossibly tall, thin figure draped in a black cloak that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore a wide-brimmed black hat that cast his face in impenetrable shadow, assuming he had a face at all. No one who claimed to have seen him could recall any features beneath that hat, only darkness. He never moved suddenly. When he appeared, he was simply there, as if he'd always been standing in that spot. When he vanished, it was between blinks or lightning flashes. Most disturbing was his purpose. Every documented sighting preceded a disaster: earthquakes, fires, floods, building collapses, accidents, murders. The time frame varied from hours to weeks, but the tragedy always came. The earliest reference I could find dated back to ancient Rome. Pliny the Elder's writings contained a brief mention of a figura pluvii, rain figure, said to appear before great calamities. The description matched: tall, cloaked, faceless. But why did he appear? Was he causing these disasters or merely observing them? Was he a warning, an omen, or something else entirely? My obsession consumed me. I stopped meeting friends, called in sick to work more often than I showed up. My apartment became a maze of papers, printouts, and notes connected by red string like some conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Sarah stopped by one evening, concern etched across her face. "Marcus, you need help. This isn't healthy." "I saw him, Sarah. I know I did. And he's real. Look at all of this. I gestured wildly at my walls of evidence. Centuries of sightings, all describing the same thing. The same pattern. Even if something strange is happening, she said carefully, what can you do about it? You saw this figure once. It's not like he's going to appear again. But she was wrong. It happened 4 weeks after the first sighting. Another storm rolled into Portland, this one more violent than usual. Weather reports called it unprecedented, warning people to stay indoors. I stood at my window, watching the rain slash sideways across the street. Part of me hoped he would appear again. Part of me dreaded it. Then, at the edge of the streetlight's glow, he materialized. The Rainman stood at the end of my driveway, that same unnatural stillness, that same sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. This time I didn't freeze. I grabbed my phone and ran outside, rain instantly soaking through my clothes. "Who are you?" I shouted into the storm. "What do you want?" He didn't move. Didn't acknowledge me. Just stood there, and I realized with creeping horror that he was even taller than I'd first thought. At least 8 feet, maybe more. The cloak hung from his frame like funeral shrouds. I raised my phone to take a picture, but the screen flickered and died. The streetlight above us began to strobe, then burst in a shower of sparks. In the renewed darkness, illuminated only by lightning, I stepped closer. I needed to see his face, needed to understand what I was dealing with. 5 feet away. 4. 3. The smell hit me then, not decay or anything organic, but something older. Like ozone and wet stone and the metallic tang of fear itself. 2 feet away, and I reached out my hand, compelled by some force I couldn't name. My fingers were inches from that black cloak when he was simply gone. Not walking away, not fading, just absent, as if he'd been edited out of reality. I stood there in the pouring rain, my hands still outstretched, and began to laugh. It was the laughter of someone whose mind was starting to crack under the weight of impossible knowledge. 3 days later, the Willamette River flooded. A historic surge of water that shouldn't have been possible given the weather patterns. An old apartment building near the waterfront collapsed, weakened by the flooding. 12 people died. I watched the news coverage in my darkened living room, my hands shaking. I'd seen him. I'd seen the warning. And I'd done nothing. Could I have prevented it? If I'd reported the flooding risk, would anyone have listened? Would it have even mattered? The guilt was suffocating. I'd been so focused on understanding the Rainman that I'd forgotten what his appearance meant. People had died, and I'd had advance warning, cryptic and unexplainable, but warning nonetheless. That night, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. You're not the first to seek understanding. You won't be the last. The Rainman doesn't cause tragedy. He bears witness to the threads of fate already woven. Some truths are meant to remain mysteries. Stop looking, or you'll become what you seek. The email vanished from my inbox as I read it, as if it had never existed. but it was too late to stop. I'd gone too far, learned too much. I spent the next month diving even deeper, finding connections in ancient texts that shouldn't exist. References to watchers and witnesses in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Celtic mythology. The Rainman wasn't alone. He was one of many entities that existed at the intersection of fate and reality, observers of humanity's darkest moments. They didn't intervene. They couldn't or wouldn't. They simply watched, bearing witness to the suffering that was always, inevitably, coming. And those who saw them, who truly saw them and understood what they were, faced a choice: go mad with the knowledge or accept it and move forward. 2 months after my first sighting, I had one last encounter with the Rainman. It wasn't raining. It was a clear, cold night, and I was walking home from my first day back at work after a mandatory leave. I'd been seeing a therapist, trying to rebuild the life I'd nearly destroyed. He stood at the corner under a streetlight, impossible and yet undeniably there. No rain fell, which broke every pattern I'd documented. This time, I didn't approach. I simply stopped and looked at him, really looked, without fear or obsession. Just acknowledgement. And for the first time, I understood. The Rainman didn't appear before tragedies to warn people. He appeared because he had to. He was bound to witness suffering, to mark the moments when fate's darkest threads pulled taut. He was as much a prisoner as a herald. The rain began to fall, just around him, a localized shower that defied meteorology. And in that moment, standing in the shower of impossible rain, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The slight slump of his shoulders, the way he stood like someone bearing an unbearable weight. He wasn't a monster. He was a witness to humanity's endless cycle of tragedy and rebirth. And perhaps, I realized, he was as lonely and haunted as I'd become. I raised my hand, not in greeting but in acknowledgement. Fellow witness. Fellow bearer of dark knowledge. The rain stopped. He was gone. And I somehow knew I would never see him again. In the weeks that followed, I learned that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The Rainman exists, of that, I'm now certain. But understanding why or how doesn't change the fundamental truth. Tragedy is woven into the human experience. We can't prevent every disaster, can't see every danger coming. What we can do is choose how we respond when darkness comes. We can witness each other's pain, offer comfort, help rebuild what's been broken. We can be present for the moments that matter. I still keep my research locked in a box in my closet. Sometimes, during storms, I look out my window and wonder if he's out there, standing vigil over some other impending sorrow. The investigation taught me something I didn't expect. The true horror isn't in the supernatural or the unexplained. It's in the suffering we ignore, the warnings we dismiss, the connections we fail to make until it's too late. I never learned where the Rainman came from or why he appears. But I learned that some witnesses carry their knowledge like a burden, standing in the rain of humanity's darkest moments, unable to intervene but unable to look away. And sometimes, just sometimes, being seen, truly seen, is enough to make the weight bearable. 3 months ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded. It showed a rain-soaked street in what looked like Victorian London. In the background, barely visible through the storm, stood a tall, thin figure in a black cloak and hat. Written on the back in elegant script, "We all witness something. Choose what you'll see." I keep the photograph on my desk. A reminder that I'm not crazy, that what I experienced was real. But also a reminder that knowledge isn't always power. Sometimes it's just responsibility, the responsibility to bear witness, to remember, and to help others through the storms that inevitably come. The Rainman still appears, of that I'm certain. Somewhere in the world, on a night of heavy rain, he stands and watches. And maybe somewhere someone else sees him and begins their own investigation. I hope they find their answers faster than I found mine. I hope they understand sooner that the mystery isn't what matters. What matters is what we do with the knowledge that darkness is coming, that suffering is inevitable, and that the only real choice we have is whether we'll face it alone or together.